Welcome back to the report. Now, Prime Minister David Cameron has been calling for new laws that will give the government increased access to citizens' private communications. Critics have called it a Snoopers Charter. Ayman Al-Rafai has more on this.
When people feel under threat, very often a desire for an increase in surveillance ensues. The logic is obvious. If everyone is being watched, then when potential attackers begin to make plans, they are spotted quickly and stopped in their tracks. And this seems to be the logic that David Cameron is following, as his proposals for new communications legislation show. Cameron cites two possible methods for collecting data on communications. As for the first, there is the collection of communication data. This covers, for example, who made a phone call to who and when. Cameron says that this type of data is crucial in not just terrorism cases, but also in finding missing persons, murder cases and the like. The second type of collection of communications information, however, and which Cameron admits is much more contentious, involves not just the whos and whens, but also the whats. If the legislation is approved, the government will have access to all communications, all text messages, applications, messages, and emails. Cameron's argument is based on the question, in our country, do we want to allow a means of communication between people which, even in extremis, with a signed warrant from the Home Secretary personally, that we cannot read? Critics have put forward many problems with this approach to security, however. In his article, David Cameron's internet surveillance plans rival Syria, Russia and Iran, Cory Doctorow says what he thinks Cameron thinks he's saying. We will command all the software creators we can reach to introduce backdoors into their tools for us, responding that there are enormous problems with this. There's no backdoor that only lets good guys go through it. Continuing, if your WhatsApp or Google Hangouts has a deliberately introduced flaw in it, then foreign spies, criminals, and crooked police will eventually discover this vulnerability. But while Doctorow makes mention of further security threats brought about by such measures, he doesn't talk about other issues such as liberty and the right to privacy. Ayman Al-Rafai, The Report.
Well, joining me to discuss this is Carl Miller, who's Research Director for the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos. Carl, how large a threat is this to people's privacy? I mean, there's a question hanging there, isn't there? You know, that Cameron says we need this to go after the bad guys, but what he really should be saying is we're going to be looking at all of you.
No, I don't think that's true at all. So there's a big distinction here between capability and oversight. Capability governs exactly what the intelligence agencies can do at any particular point, and oversight governs exactly what they do according to the law and according to ethics. Now, we really have to split these two things apart. So when David Cameron says that he doesn't want there to be any dark spaces on the internet, any places where in extremists, GCHQ can't listen to your calls at all, well, I actually think that's a principle which most of us can relate to. I, for one, don't want any governed spaces where if there is a clear need and if there is a clear threat, then the state agencies cannot really access that if they really need to. That's really very different, that question of capability, from the question of when they, in fact, are able and legally empowered to do that.
Well, Carl, just before you go on to that second question, which you know, most people will say that's where the nub lies, but even on the first question, if there's a back door where they can observe the bad guys, there's a back door where they can observe everybody. So shouldn't we have an assumption that we're allowed to communicate privately as citizens without the state having the capacity to snoop on us?
And that's probably where I depart from the Prime Minister. So I agree with him in principle that dark spaces shouldn't exist, but I cannot see in practice how this can actually responsibly be done without undermining all the many benefits the internet brings us. I mean, you're completely right. Encryption, this technology which protects terrorists, protects all of us and underpins all the many services which we use on the internet, everything from the integrity of our email to shopping and banking. And we really have very little detail yet, and let's remember that at the moment we're going on very little information from the Prime Minister too about exactly how he intends to get rid of these dark spaces. But that practical question of exactly how this can be done, without eliminating all the very legitimate use of the internet, I think is a real rub of the issue here.
Well, let's move on to the question of oversight, and you know, you said there are two issues here: can they do it, and the conditions under which they would be allowed to do it. On the second issue, I think many people feel that the security services are famously unaccountable, and so if you give them the capacity to do it, they will do it, and they will do it in ways that we don't like.
I think that's a really dangerous and common misconception. So we have a whole oversight machinery in the UK, which is really not well understood at all, called the Regulation of Investing Powers Act, a whole kind of network and mesh of different, actually very complex and technical legislation, which defines quite clearly the cases where an intrusion into privacy can be made, the context which justifies that intrusion, and then which body oversees and audits that intrusion. So there certainly is a machinery there. Now, there is a debate about whether that machinery is fit for purpose, a legitimate debate, and I think there are weaknesses in it. But the difficulty that I have, and one of the difficulties which it's just coming around again, this has been something which has been popping up over the last few years, is that the kind of public understanding of the role of intelligence agencies in a democratic society is very low. We don't have very good mechanisms to allow the intelligence agencies to discuss openly the threats which they think the UK face, the things which they think they need to do the job, and the very real pressures and challenges which they're labouring under to keep us all safe every single day. So if you talk to many people on the street, they would have no idea what RIPA is. They have no idea what laws are in play. And therefore, all of that underpins this idea that, well, the intelligence agencies can get away with whatever they want. That is really emphatically not the case. We have a legal regime. It's fairly effective. It does have some weaknesses to it, and there's a welcome debate that's being had quite ferociously around what we can do to improve that. But that's completely different from the idea that intelligence agencies get away with whatever they want. That's just simply not true.
Well, I guess that sort of conception in people's mind has probably been placed there in recent years by the phone hacking scandals, in which the police were involved. Police not being the security services, but in most people's view, probably don't have the power of the security services either. So there may be some regulatory scheme in place, but is it really used, and is it really effective? I mean, for instance, if I am an MI5 officer and I want to spy on, say you, who stops me?
So if you're an MI5 officer and you want to read my emails, you need to first off get agency sign-off from a senior person within MI5. That turns into a warrant which finds its way onto the Home Secretary's desk that needs to get signed. And that's audited by a retired judge, one of the commissioners that we call them, that form part of this machinery, who will look at each case and decide whether, crucially, that was a proportionate and necessary interference with my or your liberty. All of that is a kind of constantly moving mechanism which tries to ensure that abuses don't happen, and that the people within the intelligence agencies and the police and local councils and everyone else that uses this legislation to intrude upon people's privacy do so along the lines that are judged to be publicly acceptable.
And is that ever a publicly acknowledged process? I mean, even in general statistical terms, for instance, do we ever find out that there were, out of the total number of requests that were made, there were 20% that were turned down, or 50% that were turned down?
So the commissioners write annual reports which detail their views on how well the regime is being used, and it actually provides. I mean, they're ridiculously underread given how important these issues are. And given the kind of ferocity and heat of opinion on both sides of this debate. But there is kind of public channels for public communications of that kind. Likewise, the Intelligence and Security Committee, a committee of Parliament, also holds public hearings which detail this kind of information. Now,
but is there enough detail in those reports for us to be able to judge this? I mean, for instance, if we saw that 2 years ago 20% were turned down, and now it's 60%, we'd say, OK, what's going on here? You know, they're making a whole bunch of requests. Even the guys internal to this are turning them down. There's a problem. Do we get that kind of oversight, even in general terms, which would be effective?
I think you're hitting on, for me, what is at the very heart of all the problems that we have at the moment, struggling with giving the intelligence agencies the powers that they need within a democratic society. And that is a big problem around public understanding of intelligence agencies. I think that it is possible to lift more information out of this kind of sphere of secrecy to kind of strengthen the ability of civic society, commentators, think tanks, academics, interested members of the public to scrutinise and be part of the process of actually overseeing how the intelligence agencies are working. And I also think it's possible, incidentally, to probably lift members of civic society into the sphere of secrecy, to give them a louder voice in this machinery, to make more normal people from normal backgrounds with a legitimately diverse opinion of the role of intelligence agencies more of a say over what is legitimate and what is not. All of that is definitely true. Now, there's a principle at the heart of all of this called proportionality. Proportionality is the idea that's how we really try and balance the idea of the intrusion into privacy against the dividend of public security. This is that vital link. And at the moment, I'm not convinced there is sufficiently kind of wide body of voices which are really informing the idea of how proportionality is actually decided upon. Now, if you look at all the people, I think they're all consummate professionals doing a good job as best their ability within the machinery, but they do come from a fairly narrow background. You've got knighted privy councillors, former judges, former military intelligence officials. These are the people that are responsible for the kind of day-to-day running of the intelligence apparatus and the oversight of that intelligence
And also,
apparatus.
do you think, I mean, we don't even have to go back to some of the miscarriages of justice that happened during the height of the Irish troubles, but I mean, do you think that when people see, say, Mozambique arrested for 7 months and then released without charge, or Shaka Arma, banged up in Guantanamo still, that isn't something that gives people a huge lot of faith that they're handing over powers to people who are going to use them properly?
I think that each of these questions that you mention, in my view, is much thornier and more difficult than simply an outrageous abuse. The Guantanamo Bay issue has largely been predicated on a problem about using evidence within open court. Now, I understand all the concerns around due process. I share them. But none of this is easy. None of this is straightforward, and I don't think any of this is simply a question of a state which wants to get rid of our civil liberties, doing what it can to do that. So partly, yes, we need the intelligence agencies to be more open. We need them to speak more openly, more constantly, more informatively about the work they're under. But we also, I think, as civic society and as the public, need to understand better the very real problems and urgencies and pressures which these people are under in trying to keep us safe. It's not down to you or me in the end of the day to stop a terrorist attack. You know, we're not the people that are responsible for ensuring that the transport network continues to run or ensuring there is not going to be a bombing on London streets tomorrow. So I can understand why these things look like abuses from the outside, but almost inevitably and invariably, when you actually tear apart each of these different questions, you find a much more mottled and difficult kind of mosaic of different issues underneath them all.
OK, Carl Miller, thanks very much for joining us, but we'll have to leave it there.
Thanks very much.
Now, while far-right political parties and organisations